The heavy steel door of the penthouse closed with a soft click as Thomas Caldwell entered his lavish home, his tired footsteps echoing through the marble foyer. It was late, far later than he had anticipated, and the dim glow of the city lights flickered through the towering windows. The weight of the day had settled on his shoulders like an invisible burden. The board meeting had been grueling, his every decision under intense scrutiny. The only solace he sought now was the peace of his home. He let out a deep breath, loosening the tie around his neck, the symbol of his unrelenting business persona. His gaze drifted over the familiar, sterile surroundings, polished wood, sleek furniture, and the sharp angles of his minimalist design. Yet there was something missing. A connection, perhaps. Something real. He couldn't put his finger on it. As he moved toward the hallway leading to the bathroom, the soft sound of running water reached his ears. He frowned, momentarily disoriented. It wasn't unusual for the staff to be working late, but he hadn't expected anyone to be here tonight, let alone in the bathroom. He pushed the door open without thinking. And then he froze. There, standing in front of the mirror, was Elena. His maid. Her back was turned to him, the water running from the sink as she hummed softly, lost in her thoughts. The steam from the hot water blurred the edges of the bathroom, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. She was dressed in nothing but a towel wrapped around her body, her long dark hair cascading down her back. For a split second, Thomas couldn't breathe, his mind overwhelmed by an unexpected rush of heat. Elena's eyes widened as she spun around, her face flushing instantly. Her body tensed, and she instinctively crossed her arms over her chest, as if to shield herself from him. I'm so sorry, Thomas stammered, his voice rough as he took a step back, his mind racing. I didn't realize you were. No, Elena cut him off, her voice barely above a whisper. It's my fault. I should have locked the door. Her eyes lowered to the ground in embarrassment, her cheeks still flushed with the sudden vulnerability she felt. Thomas opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. Instead, he found himself studying her, the way the towel clung to her skin, the way her pulse quickened under his gaze. He had known Elena for months, seen her work tirelessly around his home, but never before had he noticed the way she held herself. She wasn't just a maid. There was something more, something deeper that was now impossible to ignore. Elena quickly grabbed a towel from the nearby counter, wrapping it around her body more securely as she took a step back. I'll leave you alone, she murmured, starting toward the door. Before she could turn away, Thomas found himself stepping forward, his hand reaching out almost involuntarily. Wait. His voice was a mix of uncertainty and something else, something unfamiliar. Elena froze, her back to him as she hesitated. The room felt impossibly small, the space between them thick with tension. She didn't turn around, but her body language was clear, her heart was racing, her breath shallow. Thomas, confused by his own emotions, could hardly believe the words that escaped his mouth, stay. For a long moment, Elena didn't respond. Her pulse thudded in her ears, her mind spinning with the unexpected turn of events. Was he serious? Was he asking for something more than an apology? Finally, she turned, her eyes meeting his. The intensity in his gaze sent a shiver down her spine. And in that moment, everything changed. The distance between them evaporated as Thomas closed the gap. Elena responded instantly, the thing between them rising in a way she couldn't control. She had always kept her emotions locked away, but this was different. This was something pure, something real. She let herself give in. They finally broke, both were left unsure of what had just happened, but unable to deny that it had changed everything. Thomas took a step back, his chest heaving. His heart was pounding in his ears. I didn't mean, he started, but his voice trailed off. What could he even say? Elena, equally disoriented, could only shake her head, not knowing how to process the whirlwind that had just swept through them both. I should go, she whispered, the words trembling on her lips. And with that, she was gone, leaving Thomas standing in the bathroom, staring at the place where she had been, wondering what had just happened, and what it would mean for both of them. The next morning, Thomas woke up to an unusual stillness in the air. The kind of quiet that felt like the calm before a storm. His eyes flickered open, the sunlight creeping through the curtains of his expansive penthouse. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the hum of the city below, the traffic, the sounds of life, just another typical morning in his world. But something was different. The events of last night, the rush of unexpected desire, the heat between him and Elena, weighed heavily on his mind. He could still feel her presence in the air, like a lingering perfume. And yet, it was as though the world had shifted on its axis. Nothing felt the same. He sat up in bed, running a hand through his hair, staring out the window. It was early, still too early for anyone to be awake, yet he was wide awake. His mind replayed every moment of last night, the way her eyes had widened when he'd walked in, the surprise, the tension, and then the kiss. The fiery kiss. The way they both surrendered to the moment, without thought, without hesitation. His fingers pressed against his temple, trying to push away the nagging voice that kept asking the same question, what now? He got out of bed, his feet touching the cold floor, his thoughts swirling. It had been a mistake. It had to have been. There was no way something like that could happen again. But there was that feeling, those sparks that had jumped between them. They couldn't just pretend it hadn't happened. And that thought, that persistent realization, gnawed at him. Meanwhile, Elena was in her own turmoil. Elena's day begins. Elena stood in the kitchen of her small apartment, staring at the coffee pot. It was only 7 a.m., but she had been awake for hours. The memories of last night played on a loop in her mind, making it hard to focus on anything else. She hadn't expected it, she hadn't even thought about it, but when it happened, she had felt an undeniable pull. She hadn't seen him that way before, Thomas Caldwell, the billionaire. The man who had hired her, who had treated her like any other employee, had never looked at her with the kind of raw intensity she had felt in that moment. It was as if they were two strangers meeting for the first time, yet with a familiarity neither could explain. She had been vulnerable, exposed in ways she hadn't anticipated, and he had been just as lost as she was. The door to her apartment creaked open, breaking her thoughts, and she turned to see her younger brother, David, entering. He was still groggy from sleep, his eyes barely open, but the sight of him grounded her. "Good morning, sis," David mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "What's going on with you today? You look off." Elena forced a smile, handing him a cup of coffee. "I'm fine," she said, her voice slightly more strained than usual. "Just a little tired." David raised an eyebrow. "Tired? You're always tired. Did something happen?" The question lingered in the air, and for a moment, Elena considered telling him about what had happened. But no, she couldn't. The weight of the secret, the weight of her emotions, was too heavy. She had to keep it to herself. The truth was far too complicated to explain, especially to someone who had no idea about the life she led. She took a deep breath. "Nothing happened, David. Just work stuff, you know." David looked unconvinced but didn't press further. He was always concerned about her, ever since their parents had passed away. It had become Elena's responsibility to care for him, and she was used to keeping things together. But now, the cracks were beginning to show. Last night was something she couldn't just sweep under the rug, not without addressing it. Back to Thomas. Thomas sat at his desk, the city stretching out before him as the morning sun cast a warm golden light across his office. His mind wandered back to the encounter, the way his hands had ached to touch her, the way her body had responded. It was more than a physical attraction, it was as if he had discovered something about himself that he hadn't known was there. He hated it. He hated the way it made him feel. Vulnerable. Exposed. This wasn't him. He had never allowed himself to become emotionally entangled in something like this. He had built walls around his life, around his heart, and nothing, no one, was supposed to breach them. Not even Elena. But as much as he tried to push the thoughts away, they came rushing back. He had seen her in a new light, a completely different light, and it was more than he had bargained for. He needed to get control of the situation, to figure out what it all meant. But the truth was, he wasn't sure. The power dynamics of their relationship had shifted in a way that he didn't understand, and he was beginning to question his ability to maintain control. Later that day, Elena found herself back at the penthouse, cleaning the massive windows that overlooked the city. She had become accustomed to the routine, cleaning, tidying up, staying out of the way. But today felt different. Every time she saw him, her heart raced. Thomas walked by her, his presence overwhelming. She could feel his eyes on her, but she couldn't look at him. She couldn't bear to. As she moved around the room, pretending to focus on her work, Elena's thoughts wandered back to their brief encounter. Her body responded to him in a way she couldn't explain. But it was more than that. There was a connection, an intensity that she couldn't ignore. She wanted to deny it, to push it away, but it kept coming back, like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. She could feel the tension between them, thick in the air. It was impossible to ignore, and every time he looked at her, she found herself wondering, did he feel it too? Thomas's dilemma. Thomas walked through the grand hallway of his penthouse, running his hand along the polished surfaces of the walls. The vast space felt too empty today, too cold. He had always prided himself on his control, on the walls he had built around his life, but this was different. He could no longer pretend that everything was the way it had been before. His attraction to Elena, his feelings for her, had changed everything. He leaned against the wall, staring out at the skyline. The weight of his own thoughts was unbearable. What was he supposed to do now? In the silence of his office, the stillness of the penthouse, Thomas couldn't escape the one question that had been haunting him all day. What had he done? Later that evening, Thomas found himself standing in front of Elena's door. He had asked her to come to his office, to talk. The idea of it made his stomach tighten with unease. What would he say? What could he say? The doorbell rang, and his heart skipped a beat. Elena stood before him, her expression neutral, her eyes guarded. The tension between them was palpable, but there was something else too. Curiosity. Desire. They both felt it, even if they couldn't admit it. Elena, he said, his voice softer than usual. We need to talk. She nodded, stepping into his office. The door clicked shut behind Elena as she entered the office, her footsteps soft against the polished floors. She could feel the weight of his gaze, but she kept her head slightly lowered, her hands clasped in front of her, trying to maintain some semblance of control. The space between them felt immense, even though they were standing just a few feet apart. Thomas was sitting at his desk, his posture rigid as always, but there was an underlying tension to his demeanor that Elena couldn't ignore. His usually commanding presence had a certain vulnerability to it now. His broad shoulders were hunched slightly, as if carrying the weight of an unspoken truth. Elena shifted nervously, then cleared her throat. You wanted to talk. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, betraying the swirl of emotions she was trying to suppress. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, Thomas stared at her for a long moment, his eyes scanning her face as if trying to read something that wasn't written there. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his fingers steepled together in thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. I don't know what happened last night, Elena. His eyes flickered to hers, and she could feel the rawness in his words. But I can't pretend it didn't happen. Can you? Elena's breath caught in her throat. She had been dreading this conversation, and now that it was here, she found herself struggling to find the right words. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her palms began to sweat as the memory of their heated kiss flashed through her mind. It was hard to forget that moment, the way their bodies had responded to each other without thinking, without hesitation. The way she had felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. She began, but her voice faltered. She clenched her fists to steady herself. I don't know either. Thomas sighed, standing up from his desk. He was pacing now, his movements sharp and deliberate, as if trying to physically move away from the tension in the room. This is not what I wanted, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. I've spent my life building control, building walls. And last night, that moment with you, it's not just about what happened. It's about how it makes me feel. Elena's stomach tightened. She had been trying to distance herself emotionally from the situation, but hearing him speak like that, with such openness, made it impossible for her to keep her own feelings hidden. I didn't plan it either, she said softly, meeting his eyes for the first time since she entered. I didn't expect to feel the way I did. But it's not just that night, Thomas. Since the moment you walked in on me, something's changed between us. Thomas stopped pacing and turned to face her. His eyes were dark, intense, and his jaw tightened as if he was holding back more words than he cared to admit. I can't just ignore it, Elena continued, her voice gaining strength. I've tried to, but it's still there and we both feel it, whether we like it or not. Silence hung between them, thick and heavy, as the truth of her words settled in the room. I'm not like you, Elena continued, her voice cracking slightly. I don't have the luxury of ignoring things. I have to deal with them, or they eat me alive. And I don't know what I'm supposed to do with what happened. Thomas moved closer to her, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for answers he wasn't sure he would find. His voice softened, taking on a more vulnerable tone. What do you want, Elena? What do you need from me? She took a shaky breath, the weight of his question pressing down on her. The truth was, she didn't know what she wanted from him. She wasn't sure if she could even ask for anything from him. All she knew was that whatever this was between them, it was impossible to ignore. I don't know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just know that, it can't be the way it was. Not anymore. The conversation takes a turn. Thomas stepped back, running a hand through his hair, frustration flickering in his eyes. You're right. It can't be the way it was. He was quiet for a moment, before looking up at her again. His expression was more intense, almost desperate. But what is it now, Elena? What does this mean for us? Elena's throat went dry as she stared at him. She had been preparing herself for this conversation, but the words still eluded her. She had never imagined being in this position. A maid. A billionaire. It was a world of difference between them, and yet, somehow, their paths had crossed in a way that neither could deny. I don't know what it means, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But it's not just a mistake. It's something bigger than that. Thomas took a step toward her, his eyes searching her face, as though he were trying to reach her through the walls she had put up around herself. What do you need from me, Elena? Tell me. I'll do whatever it takes. For a moment, Elena felt a flicker of something that made her want to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way through this. But she had to be careful. She couldn't let herself fall for the idea of what could be. She had seen how easily it could slip away, how quickly people could change when things got complicated. I don't know what I need from you, she said, shaking her head. But I do know that this, whatever this is, can't go on the way it has. It's not fair to either of us. Thomas closed the gap between them, his hand reaching out, almost touching hers, but stopping just short. I'm not asking for fairness, Elena. I'm asking for clarity. For us to figure out what this means, together. Her heart raced as she looked at him, searching for something, anything, that would give her the answers she needed. But she couldn't find them. Not here. Not in this moment. I need time, she said, her voice steady, but her insides were trembling. I need time to figure this out. To figure out what I want. And I think you need the same. Thomas nodded, his jaw clenched tightly. I can give you that. I'll give you whatever you need. She gave him a small nod, then took a step back, breaking the connection that had built between them. It was difficult, more difficult than she had expected, but it was the only way. She needed space to breathe, to think, to not be consumed by this overwhelming feeling she couldn't escape. I'll see you tomorrow, she said softly. And with that, she turned and left the office, leaving Thomas standing in the quiet room, his mind a tangled mess of emotions he couldn't untangle. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Elena's heart was still racing. The conversation had only made things more complicated, but at least she had made her feelings clear. She needed space. She needed time to breathe. The last thing she wanted was to get caught up in something she couldn't control. As she walked back to her apartment, the cool air brushing against her face, Elena couldn't help but think of the intensity in Thomas's eyes, the vulnerability she had seen in him that she hadn't expected. For a moment, it had almost felt like he wasn't the man everyone thought he was, like he was just human. But that didn't matter, did it? She had too much on her plate already. She couldn't afford to let herself fall for someone who was, ultimately, out of her reach. The distance between them was too vast, and no matter how much they both felt, nothing could change that. Elena had spent the last few days avoiding Thomas. It wasn't intentional, at least, she hadn't meant to keep her distance. But the weight of the encounter between them had lingered like a shadow in every corner of her life. The way his touch had sent a shockwave through her. The heat in his eyes that couldn't be denied. It wasn't just a moment of weakness, it was something deeper, something that refused to fade away. Her work had become a blur. Cleaning, tidying up, and trying to focus on the task at hand, all while her mind kept circling back to that night. Every glance she had caught from Thomas felt like it carried an unspoken question. What now? It was a question she couldn't answer. The penthouse had become an environment charged with a heavy silence between them, like two magnets that couldn't quite connect yet were drawn to one another with an irresistible force. She couldn't ignore the tension in the air every time they crossed paths, nor the way her heart would race at the mere sight of him. It wasn't just physical, though. Elena knew that. It was something more, something intangible. The power dynamics between them had shifted, but she wasn't sure in what direction. And the more she tried to push it away, the stronger the pull became. Elena had spent the last few days avoiding Thomas. It wasn't intentional, at least, she hadn't meant to keep her distance. But the weight of the encounter between them had lingered like a shadow in every corner of her life. The way his touch had sent a shockwave through her. The heat in his eyes that couldn't be denied. It wasn't just a moment of weakness, it was something deeper, something that refused to fade away. Her work had become a blur. Cleaning, tidying up, and trying to focus on the task at hand, all while her mind kept circling back to that night. Every glance she had caught from Thomas felt like it carried an unspoken question. What now? It was a question she couldn't answer. The penthouse had become an environment charged with a heavy silence between them, like two magnets that couldn't quite connect yet were drawn to one another with an irresistible force. She couldn't ignore the tension in the air every time they crossed paths, nor the way her heart would race at the mere sight of him. It wasn't just physical, though. Elena knew that. It was something more, something intangible. The power dynamics between them had shifted, but she wasn't sure in what direction. And the more she tried to push it away, the stronger the pull became. Thomas had tried to maintain his usual control. He had thrown himself into his work, focusing on the day-to-day of running his tech empire, trying to forget about the emotional chaos that Elena had triggered in him. But that proved impossible. She had been on his mind constantly. He couldn't escape her presence, couldn't ignore the way she had made him feel, vulnerable and alive in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't the type of man who let his emotions rule him. He had built his empire by being relentless, by being in control at all times. But the encounter with Elena had stripped away that sense of certainty. He had been caught off guard by how much it had shaken him. And that feeling, of wanting something more than just a fleeting moment, was something Thomas wasn't accustomed to. He didn't let people in. He never had. He had always kept his emotions at arm's length, but with Elena, it was different. He sat in his office, staring out at the sprawling city below. His thoughts kept drifting back to her, the way she had looked at him, her lips soft and trembling under his kiss. It wasn't just physical attraction. It had been an emotional collision, one that neither of them had been prepared for. "Get a grip," he muttered under his breath, running a hand through his hair. He couldn't afford to lose focus. But every time he thought he had pushed her from his mind, she crept back in, haunting him. It was late afternoon when the two of them found themselves in the penthouse once again. Thomas had called Elena into his office, a request that hadn't been out of the ordinary. But today, something felt different. Elena walked into the office with her usual poise, but her heart was racing. She hadn't spoken to Thomas in days, and the absence of their usual exchanges had only made the silence more deafening. Thomas was seated at his desk when she entered, his gaze shifting from the papers in front of him to her. The moment their eyes met, Elena felt the old tension surge between them, thick and heavy. She stopped in her tracks, unsure whether to stay or retreat. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, her voice steady, though the butterflies in her stomach were impossible to ignore. Thomas nodded slowly. "Yes. I wanted to talk." He stood up from behind the desk, walking toward her with purpose. The space between them seemed to shrink with every step he took. Elena could feel the heat of his presence, the pull she could never escape. Her breath caught in her throat as he stopped just inches from her. "I know we've both been avoiding this," Thomas said quietly, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But we can't keep pretending that nothing happened." Elena's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't speak at first, unsure of how to respond. She had hoped time would give her some clarity, but all she had was confusion and longing. "I don't want to ignore it either," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt vulnerable, exposed, standing so close to him. His presence was overpowering, and she could feel her body responding to his proximity despite the chaos in her mind. "I'm not going to lie," Thomas continued, his voice now softer, more earnest. "What happened between us, it wasn't just a mistake. I can't pretend it didn't mean something." Elena took a step back, her mind spinning. "Thomas, she cut herself off, unsure how to finish the sentence. What were they supposed to do now? "I know," he said, his voice steady but filled with intensity. "But we need to figure this out. I can't pretend like I don't want more. I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't. And I think you feel the same." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken desire. Elena's heart was racing, and her mind was a whirlpool of emotions. She had felt the same pull, the same undeniable connection, but was she ready to cross that line? To risk everything? She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, Thomas reached for her, a wordless invitation that Elena couldn't refuse. It happened slowly, a mixture of want and something deeper, something both fragile and powerful. Lost in the moment, in the sensation of being wanted, of being seen. Everything seemed to disappear. There was only Thomas. Only the connection that bound them. And for a brief, fleeting moment, Elena allowed herself to surrender to it. But as their kiss broke, reality returned with a sharp clarity. Thomas stood still, his breath shallow, as he looked down at her. His eyes were intense, filled with something neither of them could ignore. "We can't keep doing this unless we know what it means," he said, his voice hoarse. Elena stepped back, her body still humming with the aftereffects of the kiss. She felt her pulse racing, her emotions swirling. I need to think, she said, her voice trembling. Thomas nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. The intensity of their connection hadn't faded, it had only grown stronger. As Elena left the office, her mind was a whirlwind. She had never imagined her life could change so suddenly, so drastically. Her relationship with Thomas was a dangerous tightrope, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to fall. But the pull between them was undeniable. Thomas watched her leave, his mind equally unsettled. He had never wanted anything more, and yet, the fear of what it would cost him was overwhelming. Both of them stood on the edge, staring into an uncertain future, knowing that the boundaries they had once kept intact were now blurred beyond recognition. It had been a week since their last conversation. The weight of the unspoken words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and every time Elena walked into the penthouse, she could feel it pressing down on her. The distance between her and Thomas had become almost unbearable. They'd avoided each other for the most part, exchanging pleasantries that felt as empty as the grand hallways they walked through. But today, Thomas had called for her again. His request had been simple, though the tone in his voice had sent a shiver down her spine. He wanted her to come to his penthouse for a meeting, a work-related one, he said. She knew it wasn't about work. It never had been. The subtle but undeniable pull between them was impossible to ignore, even if they both tried to. As she made her way to his office, Elena's mind raced with conflicting emotions. What did he want now? After everything that had happened between them, could they go back to being the professional employer and employee they once were? The elevator doors opened, and she stepped into the lobby, her heart beating in her chest. The grand doors of the penthouse stood before her, and as she pressed the doorbell, she wondered what awaited her inside. Thomas had changed since their last encounter. He had always been commanding, every word calculated, every decision made with the certainty that only a billionaire could possess. But now, there was a subtle shift in him. He was less guarded, more unpredictable. Elena couldn't help but wonder if the walls around him were beginning to crack. When the door opened, he stood there, his figure tall and imposing, yet there was something softer in his eyes. An openness that had been absent before. Elena, he greeted her, his voice almost too gentle for a man of his stature. She nodded, unsure of how to respond. She had expected this moment to feel tense, but instead, there was a strange calm in the air, as if both of them were walking on a fine line between control and chaos. "Come in," Thomas said, stepping aside to let her in. As she walked past him, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had shifted between them, something deeper had been ignited, and it was no longer just a matter of attraction. There was power in the way they connected, and that power was both exhilarating and terrifying. The penthouse felt different too. The large windows offered a view of the sprawling city below, the lights flickering like stars. The minimalism of the space somehow felt warmer, more inviting than it had before. The atmosphere in the room was thick with anticipation, but Elena could tell it wasn't just about the meeting he had called her for. It was about something more, something unspoken but undeniable. "I didn't want to wait any longer," Thomas said, breaking the silence as he walked toward the glass desk. "We need to talk." Elena nodded, taking a seat across from him. The tension between them was palpable, but she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. This wasn't just about work, not anymore. The game begins. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, both unsure of where to begin. Thomas had always prided himself on being in control, but now, there was something different in his gaze. The vulnerability she had seen in him before was back, and it unsettled him as much as it did her. "I know what happened between us, it's complicated," Thomas said, his voice low. "But I can't just let it go. And I don't think you can either." Elena felt her pulse quicken. She had been trying to keep her emotions in check, trying to focus on the task at hand, but it was becoming harder with every passing moment. The last thing she wanted was to let herself be consumed by him again. "I've been thinking a lot about us," Thomas continued. "About the way we connect. And I know it's not just physical, it's something more. Something that's been building between us. Elena opened her mouth to speak but quickly closed it. What could she say? She had felt the same things. The power dynamics had shifted, and the attraction they shared was no longer just about desire. It was about control, about who held the power in this relationship. I want to take this further, Thomas said, his voice firm. But I need to know where you stand. What do you want from me, Elena? Her mind raced. What did she want from him? The truth was, she wasn't sure. Everything between them had been so messy, so complicated. But there was something about him, something raw and real, that made her want to know more. I don't know what I want, Elena admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I know that it can't stay the way it was. I can't pretend that nothing's changed between us. Thomas's expression softened, and for a moment, he stepped closer to her, his hand reaching out as if to touch her. Then let's stop pretending, he said quietly. Let's figure this out. The air between them was thick with unspoken emotions. Elena could feel the electricity pulsing in the space between them. The distance they had tried to maintain was narrowing, and she could feel herself slipping, caught in the gravity of his presence. As the conversation continued, the power dynamic between them shifted even further. There was no longer a clear line between employer and employee. The boundaries had blurred, and neither of them knew where this would lead. I don't want to force you into anything, Thomas said, his voice softer now. But I need to know that you're as invested in this as I am. Elena hesitated, her mind racing. She had always kept her emotions guarded, never allowing anyone to get too close. But with Thomas, it was different. He had cracked through her walls in ways she hadn't expected. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Elena confessed, her voice trembling. But I do know that I don't want to walk away from it either. Thomas smiled, though it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of understanding, of recognition. Then we take it one step at a time, he said. For a moment, they stood there, the space between them charged with an energy neither of them could deny. The air was thick with possibility, and neither of them knew where it would lead. But for the first time, Elena felt like they were both on the same playing field. As the conversation came to an end, both Thomas and Elena knew that something had changed. The power between them had shifted, and whatever came next would not be easy. The walls that had once protected them were now shattered, and all that remained was the raw, untamed connection between them. Elena stood, her legs shaky but her resolve firm. She had made a choice, one that would shape the course of her future in ways she couldn't yet understand. Let's see where this goes, Thomas said, his voice low but steady. Elena nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what would happen next, but she was no longer afraid of it. Whatever this was, whatever game they were about to play, she was ready. It had been a few weeks since that night in the penthouse. Elena and Thomas had danced around each other, their connection undeniable but still unspoken. They had begun to bridge the gap between employer and employee, though their relationship remained complicated. There were still moments when they felt the pull of the old boundaries, the roles they had once played, but they had also come to realize that the line between them had blurred. Thomas was no longer the cold, calculated businessman who kept everyone at arm's length. He had opened up in ways that Elena hadn't expected. She had seen him vulnerable, something he rarely allowed anyone to see. Elena had changed too. She had allowed herself to feel things she had buried for years. But she still wasn't sure whether she was ready to fall into this, whatever this was. But every moment she spent in his presence made her question that uncertainty. It was a quiet afternoon when it happened. Elena had been in the penthouse all morning, tidying up, just as she always did. She hadn't expected Thomas to be home. He had mentioned a business meeting earlier that day, but she found him in his office when she knocked on the door. Thomas, she said softly, peering into the room. I thought you'd be out. Thomas was sitting at his desk, his back to the door, but when he heard her voice, he turned. There was something different in his eyes. No longer the stern businessman, but a man who seemed lost in thought. He smiled faintly when he saw her. "I was just going over some reports," he said, motioning to the papers scattered across his desk. "But I'd rather be doing something else right now." Elena stepped into the room, her curiosity piqued. She had noticed how tense he seemed, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a subtle restlessness. "You look like you need a break," she observed, walking over to where he sat. Thomas let out a sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "Maybe I do," he murmured. "I've been burying myself in work to avoid thinking about things." She tilted her head, a gentle understanding in her eyes. "What things?" He paused, as if considering whether to share what was weighing on his mind. "You. Us." His voice was quieter now, almost hesitant. Elena's breath caught in her throat. She had been expecting him to bring it up, but hearing it out loud made her heart race. "We don't have to talk about it if you're not ready," she said softly, her tone reassuring. But Thomas shook his head, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "No, I want to. I think it's time." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the tension between them palpable. Elena wasn't sure what to do next. Was this the moment they would finally cross the line? "I've been thinking about you, Elena," Thomas said, his voice low. "About us. And I know I've been pulling back, but I don't want to anymore. I want to figure this out. Whatever it is between us." Elena felt her heart race. She hadn't expected him to be so open, but at the same time, it was the very thing she had wanted to hear. She took a step closer to him, her eyes searching his face. "Do you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "I do. More than I've allowed myself to admit." Without thinking, Elena reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She felt the heat of his skin, the familiar tension between them. But now, it was different. It was no longer about control or power, it was about something much deeper. Thomas closed the distance between them, his hand gently cupping her face. The touch was soft, tender, as if he was waiting for permission. Elena's breath caught, and without thinking, she leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. In that moment, there was no going back. She knew it as much as he did. Their hearts were already entwined, whether they were ready to admit it or not. "I don't want to hurt you," Thomas whispered, his voice hushed. Elena opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "I don't want to hurt either of us. But I can't deny what I feel anymore." He leaned down, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative. But then, as their connection deepened, the kiss became more urgent, more desperate. It was as if they were both trying to catch up with the emotions they had kept hidden for so long. When they finally pulled away, both were breathless, their faces inches apart. "I think this is what we both need," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. Elena nodded, her heart still racing. "I think so too." As the day turned into evening, Thomas and Elena found themselves sitting together, side by side, in the living room. The city lights twinkled outside, and the penthouse felt warmer than usual, more like a home than an office. They talked, the conversation flowing easily between them. There was no longer any pretense, no more barriers. For the first time in a long time, Elena felt like she could be herself without fear of judgment. And for the first time, Thomas wasn't afraid to open up, to let someone see him for who he truly was. As the evening came to a close, Thomas reached out, taking Elena's hand in his. He looked at her, his expression soft. "I don't know where this is going, but I want to find out with you," he said, his voice sincere. Elena squeezed his hand, a smile tugging at her lips. "So do I." They both knew this was just the beginning of something new, something real. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt, but for now, all that mattered was the connection they shared, and the love that was beginning to bloom between them. I am, Lena replied, her voice steady. She didn't want him to see any trace of uncertainty. She had been hired for a reason, after all. She was good at what she did. He didn't acknowledge her response, but his eyes skimmed over the files she had brought in, placing them neatly on his desk. These reports need to be formatted and ready by noon. Afterward, you'll be attending meetings with me this afternoon. I don't like unnecessary distractions. Lena nodded, the air between them thick with the tension of unfamiliarity. She had heard that Alexander Wren was a demanding boss, but hearing it in person was another thing entirely. She had been working in high-powered environments for years, but this felt different. Understood, she said. She turned to leave but hesitated. Mr. Wren, do you need anything else this morning? He looked at her then, his gaze narrowing slightly as if evaluating her. It made Lena feel like she was being sized up, not just as an assistant but as a person. His eyes lingered for a second longer than necessary before he shook his head. No, he said briefly. That'll be. The penthouse felt quieter now, its once luxurious silence feeling more like a pressure cooker. Every interaction between Thomas and Elena had become laden with unsaid words and unresolved emotions. The connection that had sparked between them was undeniable, but now, more than ever, Elena was beginning to wonder if it could withstand the weight of everything they had built, everything they hadn't yet spoken aloud. For days, they had carried on as though nothing had changed. They continued their conversations, their stolen glances, and their quiet moments together. But there was an undercurrent of tension that neither could shake. Something was waiting to break, Elena could feel it in her bones. She walked around the penthouse with a heightened awareness, her mind spinning with the complexity of her feelings. She had let herself get close to Thomas, something she hadn't allowed herself to do in a long time. But now, the reality of what they were doing, what they had begun to build, felt more like a delicate house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. It was during dinner one evening that it finally happened. They were seated at the grand dining table, the city lights twinkling outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The meal was quiet, the clink of silverware the only sound between them. But the quiet was deceptive. Thomas's usual calm had been replaced with something else, something hard to place. His gaze kept flickering to her, but each time Elena met his eyes, there was an uncertainty there that hadn't been there before. Thomas, Elena said softly, breaking the silence. She had sensed the tension building, the distance between them growing with every passing moment. What's going on? He didn't respond immediately, his eyes lingering on his plate. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. What do you mean? You've been distant, Elena pressed, her voice softer now, trying to navigate the sudden fragility between them. I can feel it. Ever since we. Thomas put down his fork, his jaw tightening. Since we what? He leaned back in his chair, his eyes now narrowing, the walls beginning to go up around him again. Since we got closer. Elena swallowed, the words sticking in her throat. She had known this was coming. She had known that something was bound to crack. I just don't understand. You let me in, Thomas, and now, it's like you're shutting me out. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Thomas stood up abruptly, pacing toward the windows. I can't keep doing this, he muttered to himself, more than to her. I thought I could, but I can't. I don't know how to handle this, us. Elena's heart clenched, her eyes welling with unshed tears. She stood up, walking toward him slowly, unsure of what to say. What do you mean? Thomas turned to face her, his expression torn. I've been doing everything I can to stay in control. To keep us from falling apart. But I don't know how to keep. Elena stared at the ring, her mind racing. She had never imagined that she would find herself in a moment like this, standing before the man she loved, ready to say yes to forever. The love they shared had been so unexpected, yet it had become the most certain thing in her life. She felt tears well up in her eyes as she looked up at Thomas, her voice trembling. Yes. Yes, I'll marry you. Thomas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and smiled, his face lighting up with pure joy. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and for a moment, they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, as the city below them seemed to fade away. The following weeks were filled with excitement and nervous anticipation. Thomas and Elena began planning their wedding, but unlike their usual lives, this wasn't about perfection. It was about celebrating their love, about making the moment meaningful and true to who they were. They chose a beautiful venue in the heart of the city, a venue that reflected both their personalities, elegant, yet warm and welcoming. The wedding was set for a beautiful spring day, with flowers blooming in every corner, the scent of fresh roses filling the air. The city skyline stood tall in the distance, as if watching over them, as the day of their wedding drew closer. Elena spent the days leading up to the wedding in a whirlwind of dress fittings, meetings with florists, and last-minute details. But through it all, Thomas remained by her side. He was the calm in her storm, the steady hand that kept her grounded, reminding her that this day was about the two of them, and that nothing else mattered. The morning of the wedding arrived, and everything seemed to fall into place. Elena stood before the mirror in her bridal gown, her heart pounding with excitement. She had dreamed of this moment since she was a little girl, but now that it was here, it felt even more magical than she could have imagined. Her bridesmaids surrounded her, helping her with the final touches, but all she could think about was Thomas. The man who had changed her world in ways she never thought possible. The man she was about to marry. As she walked down the aisle, her breath caught in her throat at the sight of him standing at the altar. He looked stunning in his tailored suit, his eyes locked on hers, filled with love and admiration. The moment felt suspended in time, as if nothing else mattered but the two of them. When she finally reached him, he took her hand, his fingers trembling slightly. He whispered softly, "You're beautiful." The ceremony was a blur of emotions, vows exchanged, promises made, and tears shed. But through it all, one thing was clear, they were meant to be together. When the officiant asked if they would take each other as husband and wife, Thomas and Elena looked at each other, their eyes filled with a love that could never be broken. "I do," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I do," Elena replied, her smile radiant, her heart full. And just like that, they were married. The reception was a celebration of love, family, and the journey they had embarked on together. The guests danced and laughed, the music playing late into the night, but for Thomas and Elena, the world outside didn't exist. It was just the two of them, finally, truly, together. As they shared their first dance as husband and wife, Thomas pulled Elena close, his hands on her waist, her arms around his neck. The world seemed to disappear as they swayed to the music, their hearts beating in time. "I can't believe we're here," Elena whispered, her voice full of wonder. "I can't believe I found you," Thomas replied, his voice filled with awe. "But I'm never letting you go." And as they danced, surrounded by love and happiness, they knew that this was only the beginning of their forever. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more. Thank you.